Well, thank you all for having me. I guess I got a lot to live up to since I said it was going to be fascinating, but maybe it'll be okay to keep your attention during lunch and everything. So, but I'm going to talk about weed control in nurseries. I got some information for container nurseries, field nurseries, and a lot of this will also be applicable to the landscape as well. So why is weed control important? Well, plants have to be weed-free to be marketable. Your customers aren't going to want to buy plants if they're continually filled with weeds and have weed seed. And in a landscape, your customers are going to want weed-free landscapes. So, and then also there's a problem with the fact that the weeds will compete with the nursery crops for air, water, light, and nutrients. There was a study done back in the 70s. One large crabgrass plant in a container reduced holly growth by up to 60%. And they did another study in Arkansas, and they compared trees that were grown with, right after they were transplanted in the field, they looked at trees that were grown with vegetation in the planting row, and then also when the planting row was kept weed-free. The plants in the planting row that were kept weed-free, the growth was increased by 110%. That just show you how much that the weeds can compete with the nursery crops, especially when they're small. It can also hinder workers. If there's a lot of weeds out in the field, it can be hard to get around and move around and stuff, and that can increase labor time when they're going and doing other things like pruning or treating for insects or diseases or anything. And it can also be a safety hazard. I tore my knee up pretty bad one time. I was treating a field nursery, putting in a test, and they had just gone through and dug these huge oak trees. And so there was a hole that was about 5 feet wide and 5 feet deep, but it was covered up with weeds. So I'm just walking along, and all of a sudden I just disappeared. And I had fallen into the hole because I couldn't see it because it was all covered up with weeds. So, and then, you know, it's also, it can keep around a lot of other pests like rabbits and stuff that can injure the plants, and then stuff like rattlesnakes. And I've run into rattlesnakes a couple times out in the nursery treating stuff, and I'm not really scared of snakes, but I'm scared of getting bit by a snake. So it's just good to keep everything sanitized and clean. Can harbor diseases and insects. A lot of weeds are good hosts for nematodes, so keeping control to get out stuff like that. And so, but if you have good weed control, you can save a lot of money on other inputs like water and fertilizer and things like that. So how much does weed control cost? Well, in containers, it's probably one of the most expensive production inputs. Container nurseries will spend anywhere from $500 to $4,000 or more per acre, and that's with chemical costs and also with supplemental hand weeding. And then economic losses due to weeds have been estimated at over $7,000 per acre in some cases. In the field, there's a lot of different variables depending on if you cultivate, if you only use posts, if you use pre-zam posts. And the chemical costs in the field can range from anywhere from $10 per acre if you're using a generic to over $200 per acre if you're using tank mixes and some of the newer products. So there's a lot of different variables in the field. And then just look at your application method. That's gonna also increase your cost because you got to look at the labor involved in applying them. Hand crank, belly grinder, it takes about maybe 5 to 6 man hours to do an acre. There's an orbit air spreader. It's a big tractor mounted spreader for granular materials. You can do an acre in about 2 hours with that thing. And then high clearance boom sprayers, you can get an acre in an hour, hour and a half. Hand weeding, it'll be over 100 man hours per acre and a really bad weed infestation in containers. So that's what eats into a lot of people's profits, is that they have to go in and they have to have so many people hand weeding. And you'll look out in the field and you'll see 25 people out there pulling spurge, when a lot of that could be prevented, and they're having to pay a lot of money and labor to go back and control those weeds. And then cultivation, depending on your equipment and everything, if you cultivated your field and hoed it or tilled it under or whatever, that can be a cost as well. And it just depends, that cost would just depend on your equipment and then how often you have to do it. But if you use a slightly increased chemical cost and you also work on your prevention and sanitation practices, that can lead to significant overall savings. So preventing weeds, the top reasons for weed control problems, number one is probably poor application and calibration. A lot of times people don't really know exactly how much they're putting out, or they have old equipment that's not really up to snuff as far as their nozzles might not be working well. They're not getting good pressure out of their system and everything like that. And then a lot of times with the granular products, say they'll be calibrated for using one product and then they'll switch over to a new one where that granular size is different. And so really they don't know how much they're putting out. And I was talking to a guy from OHP, and they had gone out and they had tested a nursery that was using one of their products. And they were supposed to be putting out 200 pounds per acre. Well, in one bed they had 50 to 75 pounds per acre. In another bed it was over 600 pounds per acre. And so they were getting a lot of both they were getting some plant damage, and also they're having weed problems, and that was just a calibration problem. Then another reason that pre's fail is the weeds are already germinating, you just don't see them. A lot of times they're small. By the time you get your pre out, those weeds have already started to come up through the soil. They're just too small to see, so by the time you get your pre out, they're not going to really be effective on those already emerged weeds. And then another big one in the fields is there's no rainfall or irrigation to activate the herbicide. All the herbicides have to be activated with water somewhere between 7 and 30 days after they're applied to be activated. They need about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch in order to work that herbicide into the top inch of that soil. So if you put out the herbicide and you don't get any of that, and you don't get enough rain, well, that herbicide will be ineffective and it's not going to provide very good control. Then poor sanitation practices, that's just stuff like you'll go out to a container nursery and you'll see their bark pile, and it's got crabgrass and spurs growing all around it and even on top of it in some cases. Well, that's just spreading seed. It's a good way to spread seed throughout the entire nursery if you have it in something like a bark pile. Then another one is destroying the chemical barrier. This is big in container production, but once you put out your pre's, you have that chemical layer, that one top inch of the soil that's got the chemical barrier in it. And if you go and you stick your thumb into the pot, moving the pot, or the pot tips over, or you go and you do a supplemental hand weeding and you pull the weed out, well, that just destroys your chemical barrier, and so that gives a chance, the weeds a chance to germinate in that spot where you broke that barrier. And then bad timing, just not getting them out in time, missing an application, being a couple of weeks late on an application, and allowing those weeds to come up through after the herbicide that you'd already put out degrades. So I'm going to talk about some of the weed control best management practices to look at. Number one is just to improve sanitation throughout all parts of the nursery. The cost of prevention is always going to be lower than the cost of management. It's a lot easier and cheaper just to prevent the problem than once the problem gets bad and starts to spread. So keep weed mats, ground crops weed free. When you got them growing up on the container pads and they like to come up in the little holes on the containers, the drainage holes, they want to spread to the crop and they want to get into that container media. So you want to keep those weed pads and those mats weed free as best you can. And then when you have when you have escaped weeds, control those before they spread. If you see them coming up, under benches or in roadways, aisles, and ditches and stuff like that, you want to either spot spray or hand pull those before they can spread and get into the containers or into the planting rows. Okay, keep bark piles and other areas weed free. This is what I just talked about a second ago, but there was a study where they looked at pine bark just straight from the manufacturer, and it had just been sitting there. They potted it up in a greenhouse and looked to see if any weed seed germinated in it. Well, it was pretty clean when they got it. So most of the time, when you pot up plants and you have them growing in pine bark, and then you start to see weed seed come up, it wasn't in the pine bark already. Most of the time, it's going to be because it blew in from other areas that aren't being kept clean. So use media as soon as possible after it's mixed. Don't leave it sitting around after you mix it. That's a good way to reduce the chance for seed introduction, and also reduces fertilizer leaching. You don't want to mix up pine bark with controlled release fertilizers and leave it sitting around. Then if you're using any kind of bag products, keep those in the packaging until you're ready to use those to keep weed seed from getting into the piles. Okay, control weeds in roadways, aisles, and ditches. Mow or weed eat wherever possible. Don't let the weeds go to seed. Keep them mowed, keep them down and under control. Another good way to control those in those non-crop areas is use dense, thick ground covers, perennial grass species like ryegrass, stuff like that. I've seen people use Bermuda grass in non-crop areas. It'll outcompete a lot of the weeds. It'll also reduce erosion and reduce some of the nutrient and pesticide runoff from the nursery. Also, another way you can do it is keep those areas mulched. Apply tank mixes, mix a pre and a post in those non-crop areas. DNA pre with a Roundup will be good, or something like SureGuard if you can apply irrigation, and then go back through and spot spray with something like Roundup or a Contact to get any escaped weeds. Use weed-free liners and transplants. If you're getting plants in as a shipment in containers or even in small, like the little 1 to 2 inch liners, make sure those are weed-free. Oxalis and bittercrust are probably the biggest problems in greenhouses and in propagation. Both of those have seed capsules that are explosive, so those seeds can spread out. I think they can go over 6 to 8 feet in some cases. There's not many herbicides that are safe for non-rooted cutting, so a lot of times people will have weed control problems in propagation. So exclusion and prevention are the best methods in propagation, but a lot of times people will have those problems because there's not a lot of good options there. So a lot of times people recommend visiting your liner sources during their propagation season to check them out and just see if they have like a real big weed problem, if they're having a lot of, if they're shipping you a lot of weed seed along with the crop. And then also considering other sources if liners are consistently contain weed seed. Then start off weed-free. Preparing new fields. One way that's commonly recommended to clean up an area and prepare it for new planting would be to kill the existing weeds with something like glyphosate. That'd probably be one of the best choices. Then you wait 1 to 2 weeks for those weeds to die off after you sprayed them with the Roundup. Then you till those weeds under, and then you wait another 2 to 3 weeks to let the seeds that are right there at the soil surface, they're about to come up. You wait for those to come up, and then you till them under again. Okay? Then you go in and you plant your crop. And then after you plant, then you go in and you apply the pre after the soil settles down. You don't want to apply the pre's when the soil hasn't been settled by irrigation or after some time. And then by the final till, and then after you plant in the pre, if you can do that within 3 to 5 days, all 3 of those stages, that'll provide a good start to a field for weed reductions. Okay, in containers, maintain a good hand weeding program. You're almost always going to have supplemental hand weeding. Scout for escaped weeds, even when there doesn't seem to be a problem. You can look out and a bed will look completely clean, but there's almost always guaranteed 1 or 2 weeds that are escaped, and they'll go to seed and cause problems for you down the road. So try to stay ahead of all those. Don't let the escaped weeds start to seed. Stay on top of weeds during busy times. A lot of times during the spring when people are potting up or planting or loading trucks and stuff like that, that's when the weed control can really go downhill because they got people pulled off that were maybe scouting for weeds or doing other things, and they got to have them doing some of these real urgent tasks. So that's a big time when people can get behind in their weed control. So use a little money now to save a lot of money later, because if you miss those times during the spring to get out your pre's and get a good handle on things, it's going to cause problems for you throughout the rest of the year. Then you can modify some cultural practices that also help with weed control. Overwatering decreases weed control. If you're constantly overwatering, that's going to knock out that herbicide a lot sooner than if it was just watered as much as it needed to be. Check the uniformity of your irrigation systems. Make sure they're applying uniform, and then you also know how much you're putting out, so that you know how much you know how long you have to run that system to get that 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch to activate that herbicide properly. Group plants by water requirement. And then another thing is dibbling fertilizers. Instead of incorporating the fertilizer into the media or top dressing, you can dibble the fertilizer. I've seen a lot of people, they'll take it when they're potting up and they'll just measure out the amount of fertilizer they need, put it right underneath that root ball where they're planting it. Well, what that does is the surface of the media where the weeds are going to come in, they don't have any fertilizer to grow, so that's going to reduce your weed growth. It can also improve nitrogen use efficiency. They've looked at a lot of different species and hadn't really seen any growth differences with a dibble versus incorporate versus top dress application. Then if you also dibble, it'll reduce your fertilizer losses if any of those plants blow over. If you only top dress and then you have a bunch of plants blow over, well, you just lost all that fertilizer. Another thing is banned instead of broadcasting the field. A lot of times I've seen people broadcast fertilizers all throughout that field. Well, in the row middles where you got a lot of your weeds, you're just providing them a lot of nutrients to grow and to thrive and to get bigger and better. Then use non-chemical tools. Stuff like ground cloth. When you got tears and rips in it and stuff like that, try to replace it as soon as you can. That'll help reduce a lot of the weeds. Mulches are great to reduce weed pressure. A lot of the sensitive crops, if you have sensitive crops in containers, you don't have a lot of herbicide options for them. 1.5 inch to 3 inches of a coarse pine bark mini nugget, that'll provide really good weed control of stuff like bittercress, oxalis, and then some of the spurges. When you're using a mulch, pick a mulch that dries out quickly. You don't want something that's going to stay wet because the weeds will germinate on top of it. You need something that breaks down slowly, that's going to stick around for a while. And then also something aesthetically pleasing to customers. You don't want something that's ugly or that your customers aren't going to want. And then of course it's got to be available in your area and cheap. Pine bark mini nuggets is good. In Alabama, a lot of people use it for some of the stuff that they don't want to go and put granulars or sprays over. And they've gotten some pretty good weed control out of it when they do apply it at that 1.5 to 3 inches. Cultivate non-crop areas before production. One thing you can do in the field to reduce weed seed over time is continually cultivating non-crop areas. Basically, when you have a non-crop area, there's going to be what's called a seed bank. And so in any area, in any acre of soil, you're going to have millions and billions of seeds. Okay, so every time you till them, you're bringing new seeds up to the surface for those to germinate. But what you do when you continually cultivate that is you're just bringing them up to germinate, and then you go back in, you till over them where you killed those weeds and you controlled them, and that's letting the next set of seeds come up. So over time, that can help your weed control. It's effective on a lot of the perennial weed species that are harder to control. Sometimes you need 2 or more years to get for it to be really effective and have a significant impact on your weed prevention. The only downside is that it can damage your soil structure over time. It'll increase compaction. You can have erosion problems and stuff like that. And then if you have like a bad yellow nutsedge or Bermuda grass problem or something else that has bulbs like some of the, wild garlic and then like Star of Bethlehem, sometimes when you till those, what you're doing is you're breaking up those tubers and making your problem worse. Yellow nutsedge is really bad about that. You have a patch of yellow nutsedge and you go in and till it, and then in 3 weeks it's twice as big as it was. So it doesn't work for all weeds. And then also in non-crop areas, after you get it cleaned up, a lot of times it can be effective if you go and you put a cover crop over there. Don't just let the weeds come up and then just think you're going to go in and round up over the top of everything. But if you get something like a clover or something like that in there, and then that can outcompete some of those weeds. And then also provide nitrogen as well. Other non-chemical tools, like in containers, there's the weed cloths, weed masks, and discs. Let's see. Here's where they had this is a pelletized paper product, I believe, that they used as a mulch material. They have all kinds of fabrics and plastics. Some of them are made out of stuff like hair. Different fibers and things like that you can cut to the size of your container and put on there, and that'll help prevent some of the weeds. People are using stuff like this is You can't see it really well in that picture, but that's a pelletized ground up rubber that people put on top of the crops. They've done a lot of work with the ground up tires, stuff like that, and it can leach some, I forgot what the name of the chemical is. I think it can cause some zinc problems, and then there's also another chemical that can damage some plants with that. Also, when you use those, I'll just point this out too. One of the things that we were at the hotel, and they had the ground up tire mulch and everything out there for weed control, which it works and everything like that, and a lot of times it doesn't look that bad, but if you use it around houses and stuff like that, it can be a pretty bad fire hazard, because say somebody's out there and they flick a cigarette out thinking it's you know, just a pine bark mulch or something like that. Well, you will literally have a tire fire in your front yard, so that can be bad. So just remember that if you're in the landscaping business and you want to try using some of the rubber tire stuff and everything for somebody's landscape beds, just warn them, you know, this will cause tire fires. But just remember that no method is going to provide complete control. Use multiple methods to hit weeds from all different angles. All these weed masks and discs, they'll provide control for a while, but the weeds will start to germinate on top of them. They're not going to be completely effective, but they can provide control for a while, and they're good for some of the more sensitive crops that you don't want to apply pre's to. A good thing in the field is the different living mulches in the row middles. The two biggest ways are the living mulch in the row middles, and then also the clean cultivation. I saw this a lot when I went out to the Northwest. There was a lot of nurseries that had this complete clean cultivation where they'd have these huge fields and not a single weed in it, and they just knocked everything out. But if you have cover crops in between rows, it'll reduce erosion and compaction. It'll increase your soil organic matter, so it's helping your soil over time. The healthy cover crops, they'll suppress weeds in those row middles, improve percolation, reduce fluctuations in soil temperature, and the legumes will add nitrogen to the soil. The disadvantages are some of them will compete with your crops for nutrients and water. They do require maintenance. You have to go in and mow them. And then with some of them, they're just bad aesthetics. When people visit the nursery, they don't like to see some of the different ones. With the clean cultivation, there's reduced labor in some cases because there's no mowing. You can go in and just keep the entire thing sprayed. Reduce competition for nutrients and water, and then it also doesn't attract any pests because there's nothing in there for the most of the pests to grow on. Reduce the soil organic matter over time, destroys soil structure. It also increases erosion and compaction, and then when it's wet, you can have trouble getting into the fields with your equipment. So picking a good cover crop, you want one that the seed can be drilled easily. That's just easier to put it out. It's easier to drill the seed than to broadcast it. You don't want anything too aggressive, nothing that creeps or no spreads by stolons. Like Bermuda grass, it can be hard to control once it gets established and going. You want something that can be controlled with DNA herbicides. Low growing, no need to mow frequently. You don't want something that's going to outcompete your nursery crops. You probably want something with some shade tolerance because in most cases it can be planted under trees or large shrubs. So you don't want something that has to have a lot of sun. And then the legumes, they can provide nitrogen and suppress weeds. And so just consider what you need that cover crop for. Think of the need that you need it, how long you need it to be there, the cost, the season that you need it to be at, and then also the maintenance cost. Those are all things that you need to consider before you put out a cover crop. So some cool season legumes that are often recommended are the crimson red clover. That's a good one. It can supply 70 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per year. It's often not recommended the first year because it can get big, especially when the trees are real small and can outcompete those trees and shade them out. Hairy vetch and other vetches, that's another legume, 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Per year. Then the winter peas. Those are often preferred because those are drought resistant. Then there's some warm season legumes. The beans, cowpeas, velvet beans, soybeans, jack beans, sun hemp, that's popular in the deep south. It's not very cold hardy. Alfalfa is another one. It's a good choice. Cool season perennials, the tall fescue, it's deep rooted and aggressive. It makes a good cover crop for non-crop areas, but if you use the tall fescue, it can outcompete some of the nursery crops. It can be hard to control in the row middles. There's a fungus-free seed that can be used in row middles. There's two types of seed. One seed has a fungus, and then there's a fungus-free seed. The fungus-free seed isn't quite as aggressive as the seed with the fungus. Orchard grass, it's often chosen over fescue because it tolerates more shade, and it's also more heat and drought tolerant than the fescue. Then you got some cool season and warm season annuals. Cool season annuals are some stuff like rye, wheat, barley. Then the warm season are the millets, pearl millet, foxtail, German brown top, and then buckwheat. Buckwheat's a good ground cover. It provides really quick cover, so you can get that out and it'll get a good stand-in before the weeds can move in. Okay, use pre-emergent herbicides correctly. So read the label, follow the label. That's the biggest thing. Before you use any pre-emergent herbicide or any herbicide really, or actually any kind of crop protection product, you need to read the entire label and know it backwards and forwards before you put it out. It'll give you information on the best rate to use, the proper timing, the volume to apply that at, the different weeds that it'll control, species that are sensitive to that herbicide, also the nozzle to use, the different pressure, and then the weather conditions that you can apply that herbicide at. And then calibrate, that's the biggest thing. Make sure that you're calibrating, you know exactly how much you're putting out. Herbicides are effective in a narrow range. Too much, you waste money. You can injure plants. There's negative environmental impacts from putting out too much herbicide. And if you put out too little, you waste even more money because you have to go back in and you have to hand weed, plus you have the wasted chemical costs. Because a lot of times if you put a herbicide out at half a rate, it's not going to really provide enough weed control to justify the chemical costs for that. And then the weeds thrive. When you're not calibrated, safe herbicides become dangerous and effective herbicides become useless. And that's the law. Here's some pictures that I took of calibrated versus not calibrated, so you can see the difference. This is, I think it's, I don't know exactly what grass species it is, but anyways, you can see there's a lot of damage here when about twice the rate was put out, and then when it's calibrated, there was no difference. Here, I think those are maybe some impatiens or something. Anyways, not calibrated, it took everything out and killed everything. And then if you put too little herbicide out, you don't get any good weed control. And then calibrate for each new granular herbicide you use. Different products will have different granule sizes. They'll spread differently during application. And so when you're calibrated for one doesn't mean that you're calibrated for another. One of the new ones that's out onto the market is the indaziflam, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in my talk, but those have really fine granules, and so a lot of the reps were telling me that they were having a problem with people going out and they were calibrated to put out something like Snapshot or Ronstar, and so they were having a big problem because this indaziflam, it throws a lot differently than those other herbicides because that granule is so much smaller. So for each new herbicide that you get, you're going to need to calibrate it for that, for the granular products. Okay, so apply herbicides correctly. Apply during calm conditions. Morning is usually the best time, and it's also cooler. It's no fun to go walk out into a field or to apply a pesticide wearing a Tyvek suit in 95-degree heat. You're sitting there walking around in that suit and you're thinking, is it going to be worse for me to die of heat exhaustion now or cancer, you know, in 15 or 20 years? So it gets pretty rough. And then this is what happens when you spray during 20-mile-an-hour winds. I got cocky and thought I could control the spray, but it didn't quite work out, and I took out some boxwoods right there. And then irrigate immediately after application, at least a 1/4 inch. It's probably better to do a 1/2 inch. If you're in containers and you have overhead irrigation, as soon as you put that herbicide, go ahead and apply that irrigation. If you're in the field, try to apply before a thunderstorm. Look at the forecast. I mean, I know that they're not terribly accurate, but try to get to when you know that you're going to get some rain. And then the field drip, that's not going to activate the herbicide. That capillary movement from that water is not going to be enough to move that herbicide down to that 1 inch of soil, so that's not going to work to activate the herbicide. Know how long you have to activate it. So these are some of the different most common pre-herbicides, and this is how long you have to activate it. So you have stuff like Barricade, the prodiamine, it can wait on 14 days for rain. Then you have the pendulums and the pendimethalin products, which is the 3.3 EC and the AquaCap. Those can wait up to 30 days for rain. Pendant Magnum, it needs to be activated within 7 days. And then another one, Prince Epic, can wait 10 to 12 days. SureGuard, you got 2 weeks to activate it. Gallery, Soxabin, you have 21 days. And then the Tower, you have about 30 days. So when you apply those, just know that you have a window of time for it to be activated by the rainfall. Okay, so will cumulative rainfall work? A common assumption is if you apply that herbicide, then within that 30 days, you got several drizzles, then it added up to a ½ inch, then that's going to water in your herbicide, but that's not the case. So if a ½ inch of rain is received over a course of 30 days, the herbicide is not going to work. Intermittent wetting and drying, what that's going to cause the herbicide to do is it's going to, if it just barely gets wet and then dries out and then barely gets wet a few days later and dries out, and that happens over the course of 30 days, well, cumulatively you might have ½ inch, but what that's going to cause the herbicide to do is it's going to form to the very top layer of the soil, the very surface of the soil. It's not going to get into that 1 inch layer that you need it to be at to control those weeds as they come up. So what's going to happen is those seeds are going to start to come up, and those cotyledons are going to be able to push up through that very thin herbicide layer, and those pre's aren't going to be very effective. Okay, so another thing is apply the herbicide at the correct timing. Where we usually get into trouble is applying to sensitive species. Read the label and know the precautions for certain species. Just because a genus is listed as being safe, a lot of times there'll be another statement in there that says not all cultivars or varieties are tested. There's so many cultivars and varieties they can't test all of them, so treat a small group of plants first before you apply it to a whole block. Another way that we get into trouble is applying before the media settles, right after potting. You want to make sure that you water that plant in, get at least one irrigation cycle on it. It's probably better to have 2 or 3. And then in the field, wait till that media, the soil cells around it don't apply to cracked soil. And then also when we apply over the top during bud break or when there's any tender new growth on the plant, that's when they're most susceptible to herbicide injury. And then wet foliage, applying granulars to wet foliage. The only one that is labeled where you can do that is Snapshot, so that's the exception. But most of the time, if you apply a granular over the top of container plants that are wet, that's going to cause some damage. So the best time to apply pre's in containers while they're dormant in the late winter, early spring, before covering for winter, in the summer and the fall. When there's no new growth, the plants are pretty much dormant. There's going to be a little chance of phytotoxicity issues. And then whenever the plants are jammed can tight, that's a good time because you're going to waste as little herbicide as possible when you apply to can tight containers. And so in the field, you can apply pre's basically any time that the field is clean. Early spring, early mid-March to April, midsummer, and then fall. That's probably the most important application because that sets you up to have a good spring and next summer the next year. And then when the forecast calls for rain, because you need that rain to activate the herbicide. Okay, so potting applied to the media settles, and then about every 60 days during the season. There was a study done at NC State. Most pre's only provide control for about 4 to 6 weeks, so no herbicide is going to provide season-long control. You're going to have to go back in about every 6 weeks in a good case scenario and reapply those herbicides. And then after you go back and you hand weed a block, apply another set of pre's on top of that as soon as possible and water that back in. There's not any post options in containers, so if you wait until a big problem develops, you're going to be way behind in the game. Okay, so rotate your active ingredients and modes of action. That's where everybody got into trouble, where we have the glyphosate-resistant weeds coming up all over the place, because that's what happens when you use the same mode of action, the same herbicide over time. So the mode of action group is listed on the top of the label. When they have a combination product, it'll have 2 different groups. Don't rely too heavily on any one herbicide. Everybody has their favorite, something that's cheap and effective, but you still want to rotate, because all herbicides have weeds that they're really good on, and then probably a couple that they're not so great on, and the uncontrolled weed will take over. Then use tank mixes and different chemistries to provide broad spectrum control. These are probably the most commonly used pre-herbicides in field production. You have your broadleaf pre's and your grass pre's. Now, some of the broadleafs and some of the grasses will control both, but usually you need to mix a broadleaf and a grass to get a good broad spectrum of control. So for broadleafs, you got the oxyfluorophane, which is the gold, simazine, and isoxaben, and then the grass herbicides, the surfland, pendulums, and then the barricade products, and then pennant magnum for pre-sedge control. But basically, the reason I have this slide is you don't want to mix 2 grass herbicides or 2 broadleaf herbicides. You want to get both of them together in an application to provide a broad spectrum of control. And then identify your weeds. Know what weeds are your big problem. Determine which herbicide works best for each weed. Information on label, and then also from your own personal notes that'll be good to take. And then keep on the lookout for new weeds. These are some of the more common weeds that we see: the spurge, bittercress, the oxalis, eclipta, and then liverwort. That's a big problem in maybe shade houses and greenhouses. But I'm going to talk about a couple weeds that are maybe not bad in Kentucky now, but have the potential of spreading. Well, horse weeds here. I was just going to have this in here. That's it persists just about year round. And I have this in here because if you spray Roundup over this, it's not going to control it. A lot of times you'll go to a nursery and you'll see completely clean rows, and then you'll just see this weed popping up all over the place because glyphosate won't control it. 2,4-D will knock it down sometimes, and then Princep will provide pretty good pre-control for the horse weed. Okay, this is one that's a problem in Florida actually, and it's been reported in let's see, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. So it's moving north. I don't know if anybody has seen this one, and according to the USDA, it hasn't been reported in Kentucky yet, but this is a nasty one. The Bengal dayflower. It's also called tropical spiderwort. It's a perennial. Up north, it'll act as an annual. The reason that it's spreading is it's spreading in nursery stock. It has the white underground stems and flowers. The reason that this one is bad is because you see here, it'll produce subterranean seeds. So you have seeds that are produced underground, as well as the seeds that it'll produce above ground in the normal flower structure. And then it's also Roundup resistant. It's a noxious weed. It's on the noxious weed list. Sureguard and Broadstar too, well, it's the same herbicide, the flumioxazin, but it'll provide good pre-control. Okay, ragweed parthenium, the white top. I don't know I can't remember if the USDA had this as being in Kentucky or not, but it's all over the place too. Virginia, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Texas, and then all the Gulf Coast states, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi. It's an annual. It basically looks like a cross between a ragweed and like Dusty Miller. It's like a ragweed, but it has this whitish foliage, kind of hairy, light green, white pubescence on the leaves, white flowers. That's where it got the name white top. It's glyphosate resistance. But with this one, the best thing to do is to eradicate it from the area. And then a lot of the pre's are effective on it, but there's just not good post control for this one. And then Star of Bethlehem. Does anybody have this weed? A lot of people in Tennessee report this as being a real big problem. But it's a perennial. It's in the It's got hollow stems. They got a waxy coating. It's resistant to Roundup and then also a lot of the other posts. But it emerges from a bulb, so that's the reason that this one is a problem, because if you spray it with a contact or something, it can come right back up from those bulbs. And then if you go back in, you till it, it can just make the problem worse. It can spread with those fragments of the bulb. The Roundup will only provide marginal control. One thing that they found in a study was Gramoxone Max. It provided good burn down that also reduced spring emergence the following spring, I think by over 80%. So that was one herbicide that they saw that would work and reduce it from coming back. You can till it up before the bulbs form. The bulbs start forming in the spring. So if you go back in, you see it start coming up in the early spring, go ahead and till that in, and that can control it. But once those bulbs form and you till it, it's just going to spread the problem. Okay, so apply to avoid crop. Yes.
With that gramoxone, doesn't that like kill the earth? You can't replant in that area for so many years.
Well, it's the gramoxone. Okay, I don't like that one because well, it's good. It's a contact herbicide. It doesn't have that long persistence. It's just strictly contact. Whatever you spray, it'll kill. But it's a skull and crossbones herbicide, so respirator, the whole deal. And it's a nasty one. You go walk with it, and you're coming in hot, you know. So it's a nasty one. But that was one of the things that they found that will work for it. I don't know if they tried Diquat, which is basically this. It's the same thing in the same chemical class as that, but it's not quite as toxic. So that could be an option. But basically, what we're seeing with this one is you just need to burn it down and then wait till those bulbs, they expend all their energy and they're going to quit coming back. So apply to avoid crop injury. Always follow the label instructions. Avoid applications until plants are watered in and the media or the soil has settled. 2 to 3 irrigations are usually needed. Don't apply to cracked soil right after the plants have been planted into the field in field nurseries. Don't apply during a new flush of growth. Wait until foliage is dry to apply granulars, and then irrigate as soon as possible after application. Okay, no applications in any enclosed structures. There's no pre's that are labeled for use inside greenhouses or enclosed structures, so don't use herbicides in there. Don't apply to overly stressed plants. If plants are showing signs of drought, drought stress, water stress, nutrient deficiencies, or insect damage or fungus damage or anything like that, when you spray a herbicide over them, a lot of times you'll see increased phytotoxicity because the plants aren't able to resist that herbicide. Another thing I'll say too, weeds are kind of the same way with a lot of the post products. If you apply Roundup or something like that over top of a stress weed, that weed isn't actively growing, so it's not going to be able to absorb that herbicide well enough. So you're going to have reduced control. When you spray your weeds, you want those weeds to be actively growing. When you spray those to get the best control. Okay, back to avoiding crop injury. The EC formulations like Pendulum EC, Pennant Mag, and Tower, those can cause injury during hot weather. There's a big difference between applying an EC at 80 degrees and 95 degrees. At 95 degrees or higher, you can see some injury with those. And then always treat small areas to test new chemistries. Note the weather conditions in the crop stage during application. Wait 4 weeks before you determine if that herbicide was safe or not for that particular variety or cultivar. Okay, don't use glyphosate for sucker removal. A lot of times you have these suckers coming up at the bottom, and people will have glyphosate in their tank mixes, and they go through and they hit it. Well, it'll burn that sucker off, but that can cause damage down the line. Also don't apply glyphosate to freshly cut suckers right after they've been clipped off, because that can cause problems. Basically, over time it'll decrease the tree's resistance to disease. It'll weaken bark structure, and it'll make them more prone to cracking and having winter injury. Then the Roundup products with a high adjuvant load. Those are the worst offenders, so the ones that are really rain fast, they're rain fast within 30 minutes or an hour. Those are the worst ones to use around young trees. So contact herbicides will be better for sucker removal. Okay, keep good records of all applications. There's certain records that you have to keep for restricted use herbicides. Other good records to keep would be the weather conditions during the application, how hot it was, you know, if it was drizzly or the humidity levels and stuff like that. The plant growth stage, how big the plant was when you applied it, if there was any new growth, stuff like that. If you observed any injury in the weeks following the application, and then also following that application 3 or 4 weeks down the line, if you have one particular weed that was a problem after that herbicide was applied. Okay, continue to work to increase efficiency and reduce costs. So designate somebody to be in charge of weed control. A lot of times the nurseries that are most successful with their weed control programs are when they have one person that can be dedicated and their primary responsibility is weed control. That's not always possible, but that's an ideal situation because that can increase your organization, it can reduce confusion and ensures that all your schedules are kept and all your herbicides are going out on time. And then if you're in container production, consider adding more sprays to the program. The cost of chemicals for sprays are less. The cost of application equipment is more, but you have less non-target losses. Then you do have to have your application have to be more skilled, but overall sprays are better. They can go out quicker. You can get better coverage and you have less non-target losses with the spray herbicides. So how much are granulars really costing you? There was a study done a while back where they saw how much non-target losses were with the granular herbicides when they were applied to space containers. So can-tight container spacing, so that's if the containers are packed right side by side in a block. You're still going to get 23% non-target loss. So a quarter of your herbicide is lost no matter what. 8-inch spacing, you lose half of it. When you have 12-inch spacing, you have an 80% non-target loss. So that's a really negative impact on the environment. You leach a lot of chemicals into your water sources, and it also hurts your walk because it's costing you a lot of money to go and throw a herbicide on a ground pad. So if 50 pounds costs $100 and you apply it to 8-inch space containers, you'd be wasting $50 per bag. So say you needed 4 bags to treat an acre and you had 10 acres. So that will be a loss of $200 per acre or $2,000 per application for those 10 acres. So if you made 5 applications of that herbicide a year, that's $10,000 lost. That's just herbicides lost, and that's only at 8-inch spacing. So here's some cases where it will make sense to apply the granular herbicide when they're packed can-tight like this, and there's just a walking row up there to spray the herbicide. When you got these large containers, it doesn't really make any sense to do the granulars because you're going to mostly be wasting the herbicide. Okay, so field weed control considerations. Figure out what you're doing for weed control and figure out how much it's actually costing you. Look at your equipment cost, your labor cost, and the chemical cost. Determine how much it costs to make repeated glyphosate applications. A lot of field nurseries, all they'll do is they go in and they put Roundup out or another systemic herbicide, and that'll be all they do. And it works fairly well, but you're making a lot of applications doing that. So look at how much labor that's costing you, the equipment, look at the fuel costs, and then also look at that chemical cost over time. Glyphosate's cheap, but if you have to put it out and you have to continually put it out, it can add up over time. So could cost be reduced by using a more effective or expensive pre-herbicide in a tank mix? Well, you have to just sit down and do those calculations yourself with your equipment and then with your situation, see if that makes sense. 10 to 15 plus applications of glyphosate, and that's conservative. A lot of times you need more than that. Versus 2 to 3 applications of something like glyphosate plus SureGuard. SureGuard's expensive, but if you're able to reduce that much labor and that much chemical, that much fuel and equipment cost, it could save money over time. Okay, so use pre's that provide post control. One of the biggest problems with pre's in containers is weeds are hard to see when they're small. You see these bitter crests that are starting to come up. You can barely see them, but if you get a pre out, if you get a pre-emergent herbicide out, a lot of them aren't going to have anything to do with these weeds, and these are just going to grow up, and in 2 weeks, you're going to have a bed full of weeds. So if only a few weeds are missed, thousands of seeds will be produced from those weeds. There's a few post options. So one thing to do would be to use pre-herbicides that provide early post control to pick up those small weeds. So I'll just quickly talk about this. Some of the previous work, they found stuff that'll work on hairy bittercress. Gallery is a good one. The Broadstar and the SureGuard, those will pick up the hairy bittercress early pre, and then stuff with the oxaflorofin in it, OH2, and then Snapshot, spotted spurge, the Broadstar and the SureGuard again, and the oxaflorofin. And then crabgrass, Dimension is actually labeled to pick up crabgrass in the 1 to 2 tiller stage in turf. And then common groundsel, the Broadstar and the SureGuard controlled it early post as well. So in 2009 and 2012, we looked at several herbicides, and I'll just go through some of the main weed species that we looked at. This is spurge. This is cotyledon to 1 leaf and then 2 to 4 leaf stage. So this is what the spurge looked like when we treated them. Then this is 30 days after. The freehand and then the Broadstar and Tower and the Pendulum, they all provided pretty good spurge control early post. So that was the 1 to 2 leaf stage. And then the 2 to 4 leaf stage, basically what we saw the best control was with the Pendulum, the EC, and then the Tower. The Tower is really good for early post control, and then that has applications in containers and also in a landscape. If you go with the Tower in a landscape bed and there's spurge coming up, you can pick up some of those. With a Tower, you don't have to use a post with that if they're small. We also looked at oxalis, we looked at Tower, and then just a surfactant gallery, and then indaziflam, which is the Marengo. That's a new herbicide. The Tower and the gallery stunned the oxalis. The indaziflam completely knocked it out. And it was completely weed-free at 8 weeks. Picked it up really good early post. And then at the 2 to 4 leaf stage, nothing was really effective, but the indaziflam, it picked it up early post again when that oxalis was in the 2 to 4 leaf stage. Okay, so then bittercress. The gallery is really good for bittercress. Now this is 2 to 4 leaf stage bittercress, and this is gallery at 0.66 and 1 pound active per acre. So this is the label rate right here, the high end of the label rate. And it completely took out that bittercress by 30 days, and also providing pre-control as well. Okay, so this is 6 to 8 leaf stage. So this is pretty big. This is just before it's starting to flower in the 6 to 8 leaf stage. So this is gallery again at the 1 pound rate, and it just completely took that bittercress out. Here's the control right here. And those plants have already gone to seed. Okay, then 10 to 12 leaf stage, we took it all the way to the limit. So we treated mature bittercress plants basically. So these were big, they already had seeds in some cases, and we treated them to see if it would work. The gallery at the 1 pound active per acre, and it stunned them back pretty good. It had good control. Some of them were just not back completely, while some of them it just browned them up pretty bad, but those will probably come back from that. But it did provide pretty good control. So the benefits of using stuff like in containers, a lot in Mobile, it's really big for people to put gallery out when they have bittercress problems, because it'll keep those bittercress down. It'll control the small merged weeds, and then it'll also delay flower and provide more opportunities to hand wean before those weeds go to seed. So stuff like Tower on spurge, gallery on bittercress, those are good options to look at if those weeds are your problem. Okay, then another thing is test new products. The newest product on the market is the indaziflam, which the trade name is the Marengo. It has very low volatility and has really good control of annual and broadleaf grasses. It controls a wide spectrum of stuff. For the liquid, the SC formulation, the rate is 7.5 to 18 fluid ounces per acre. I think the most you can apply in a year is 18.5 fluid ounces acre per year. And they also have a granular product, and that label rate is 100 to 200 pounds per acre. So this is a field test that we did. This is Marengo at the set. This is the low end of the spectrum, and this is more of what they recommend in the field. Then this is let's see, 4 times the label rate right there. But this is percent weed control at 100 days. This is after treating. There was no injury on this plant species, and then you see at 100 days, we had 97% control at the 7.4 ounce per acre rate. And at these high rates, we had 100% control. And then that was similar to the SureGuard at the 10 ounce per acre rate. We had 100% control with it, and the control was only 12.5%. So we did, from 2010 to 2012, we looked at SC over a bunch of different tree and shrub species and container field nurseries. But we looked at the 3 rates of indaziflam, 7.4, 14.8, and then about 30 ounces per acre. We had a SureGuard control. Then all these applications were applied with 2% Roundup to provide post control and get those beds weed free at the same time that we applied the indaziflam. So crop tolerance, we didn't see any injury on any of the species we treated. So with the SC, we did the directed apps on over 30 species and we didn't see any injury applying it directed out. And then the 14.8 ounce rate provided 98% control 8 months after application. So it provided a really long control in the field. So we got, here's a picture. This was taken, I think this is maybe 3 or 4 months after the first application. This is a non-treated block right here. And back here, I don't know if you can see it, but this is indaziflam at 7.4 rate, and that plot is completely weed-free. The only problem that it does have is the indaziflam doesn't really provide control of nut sedge. So when there were weeds in the field, it was only yellow nut sedge in most cases. So this is Nuttall Oak. This is some of the weed control data that we had. Okay, so at 240 days after the set, we treated them twice. 240 days after the second treatment, that's 8 months, we had at the 14.8 rate, we had over 98% control. So it was very, very good. Same here with the Georgia green ash, still over 90% control at 8 months after treatment. We use it in containers. Let's see, here we go. All of them had over 90% control. This is the non-treated. It was just completely covered up with grass and eucalyptus and all kinds of stuff. And then with the Marengo, we had over 90% control. That was at 90 days after treatment with the directed app in containers. Okay, so we looked at it over the top too. You can't use the SC over the top of landscape plants. It'll damage the landscape plants, and then it's not labeled for use in containers. But it was kind of strange because with some species we had absolutely no injury, and then some it burned them back completely. So this is Laura petalum. We didn't see any injury. We had a little bit of stunting at this high rate, but really no injury to speak of. Those plants were still marketable after a month. They kind of grew out of that. And then we have gardenia. At the high rate, it just completely knocked them out and killed just about every single one of them. And then knockout rose, absolutely no injury on those. And then ligustrum, which is one of the tough ones, which ligustrum, a lot of times the chemical companies will test it first because they want to add it to the label because hardly anything kills the ligustrum. But the indaziflam SC just completely took it out. It just knocked it back completely. So you have to use this as a directed spray. You can't do it over the top. If you contact the foliage of sensitive species, it will take it out and cause some damage. They also have the granular product, and we've seen it to be really, really safe. It also provides long control, probably not as long as the spray, but it's still pretty good. This was flower and quince. Didn't have any injury on it. And then we did crepe myrtle. We did 9 woody tree and shrub species in containers. We treated them at 800 pounds, 30 days apart, twice. There was no injury on any of those species or growth reduction. And then the only time we saw any kind of growth reduction was on Bigfoot Cleyera and then Carolina jasmine, and that was at the highest rate. They were a little bit stunted, but they were still probably marketable. We used it in the landscape. We did a big landscape trial. We tested it on several annual species, and then we had some woodies and a grass in there. So it caused injury on pansies, dianthus, snapdragons. We had gardenia, Chinese holly, and then little zebra grass. They were not injured at all. Here's a snapdragon that was treated 800 pounds per acre rate. So the indaziflam will control snapdragons. It took it out. SureGuard, that's another one of the newer ones. I'll just go through it real quick. 8 to 12 ounce rate. It provides pre and then also some post activity if the weeds are usually below 6 inches. It's a really good tank mix partner with Roundup. You mix the SureGuard and Roundup, they have a synergistic effect. It can increase the control about 30 days or so, it seems. This was 150 days after these, I think this was a pine maybe. I can't remember what species this is, I can't tell. But anyway, this is 150 days after treatment. With the SureGuard and the Roundup tank mix, and those were completely weed-free. This was the control. You can see part of a SureGuard Roundup treatment right there, which was completely clean, but the control were completely taken over with all kinds of weeds. But the SureGuard and Roundup provided really good control. That'd be something good to apply in the fall to give you good control throughout the winter, and then also in the spring. Okay, so protect the chemical barrier. Like I talked about before, the pre's will form the chemical barrier in the top 1 inch, control weeds emerging through the barrier. And when that barrier is disrupted, the weeds will grow where that barrier was disrupted. So some common ways that those barriers get broken is poking holes in containers. You stick your thumb in there to move the container. You invite a way for weeds to emerge. Walking in playing rows, pruning and other activities. If you apply a pre in that playing row and you walk and you have a lot of heavy foot traffic in there, that can mess up your barrier. Equipment use, dropping pots, stuff like staking, and then also when pots blow over, that can all disrupt that chemical barrier. So carry pots correctly. Don't fill up to the top. Leave you some room to have to grab them and move them if you have to, unless you have that robot that we saw earlier today. That will work pretty good. Stabilize your plants to prevent blowover. Here's some plants that were staked up. They have some wooden posts going across that all those trees are tied to keep those from blowing over. Or they put empty pots in between these plants right here to keep those from blowing over. And then reapply pre as soon after hand weeding or cultivating. Okay, so stagger herbicide applications. Most of the herbicide runoff occurs the first 6 irrigations after you apply. So if you stagger over small areas, that's going to reduce any negative environmental impacts. And it also can reduce problems because stuff with like oxyfluorphan, it can build up in retention ponds over time. So if you recycle your irrigation water and you apply gold 15 times in a row, that oxyfluorphan can come and cause phytotoxicity issues to some species over time. So if you stagger your herbicides over small areas, and then you divide production areas that drain into similar collection ponds, if you split those up so that you're not applying oxyfluorphan to the whole nursery or any herbicide to the whole nursery, you split them up over time, that's going to reduce any concerns with pesticide runoff. That'll also allow workers to weed areas and then reapply before the weeds emerge, before they start germinating again. And then for using ground covers in between the crops, gravel works better to prevent herbicide movement than stuff like plastic or fabric. Okay, some other considerations: don't free peel pots or stack pots. Here's this block right here, and they had just stacked pots together and they've been sitting there for a couple weeks. Well, what happens is by the time they get ready to be used, they're just completely full of weeds. And then group plants to make herbicide applications more efficient. So there's stuff like hydrangeas where you're not supposed to use freehand 2 times in a row on. Well, you wouldn't put you wouldn't put hydrangeas in the middle of something that you want to apply freehand to regularly. So group plants based on herbicide tolerance and keep the ones together to make your applications easier. Okay, just only mix the amount of pesticide needed for that day. And then if you mix more herbicide and you're going to keep it and reuse it, that's not always advisable, but know the half-life of your herbicide. Okay, so SureGuard, flumioxazin, the half-life of it really degrades as the pH goes up. So know the pH of your water and how that herbicide reacts. So with flumioxazin, with the pH of 5, it lasts from 3.4 to 5 days at a pH of 5. When the pH goes to 7, it's 21 to 24, almost 25 hours. So in 25 hours at a pH of 7, that SureGuard is going to be gone. It's going to be useless. If your pH is 9, it's 14.6 to 22 minutes. Okay, so you need to check your pH, make sure you don't have any kind of pH problem for some of these herbicides, because stuff like that can cause, that can just ruin an application and make it completely ineffective. So then also consider using lower spray volumes to save time. It's a lot more efficient to apply 20 gallons per acre compared with 50 gallons per acre. You got to follow the label and do what the label says. That's first and foremost. But if you can apply a smaller volume, you might want to think about doing it. It's faster to do. You don't have to make as many trips, and you can also use a smaller tank. So, but also when you're using the 20 gallons per acre, that application rate, you have less room for error because your herbicide is going to be more concentrated. So they say there's a 10% rule where if you get your herbicide application out and you're within 10% of what you need it to be, it'll be all right. Well, if you apply 100 gallons per acre, your 10% will be 10, and 20 gallons per acre would be 2 gallons. So you just want to keep that in mind. Okay, so there was an AU study where there was no injury on hydrangea or gardenia at 25, 50, or 100 gallons per acre application. There was no difference in weed control. So the application volume doesn't really have an effect on crop injury or weed control, but it can just be faster to apply it at lower application volumes. Okay, so clean sprayers after each use. For the herbicides, they'll have stuff that tell you how to clean it after the use. You don't want to use something like SureGuard, then go back in and use Tower that you can use over the top without cleaning that sprayer, because it can cause plant damage. Okay, so final thoughts. Always focus on eradication and prevention and sanitation. Use a variety of methods to control weeds. Use stuff like fabrics, mats, mulch, ground covers. Just use the whole spectrum, everything at your disposal to control weeds. You look at it as a holistic approach, not just looking for a magic bullet. Change your cultural practices to improve weed control. Look to increase your water efficiency, your fertilizer placement. Keep your fallow fields managed. And then make chemical applications more efficient and accurate. Calibration should always be your #1 priority. That'll save 95% of all the problems with weed control. And then mechanize where possible. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
This video has been part of the University of Kentucky Nursery Crops web series. For more information on the topics discussed, please contact your county extension office.